Thanks everyone for coming today. So over the next 40 to 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the year-end budget for the Health Sciences Centre. So again, thanks very much for coming. This is being taped, so we'll try and have something up online for those colleagues who weren't able to make it. So we'll allow some time for questions as well at the end. So today we'll talk about a few things. One, I do want to just dial back a little bit to March 23rd when the Dean presented the budget or the forecasted budget for year end, because there are a few pieces that do relate to the clinical education program. Talk about some definitions because we throw out a lot of acronyms, so we'll mention some of what those are. And then specifically, we want, what I'd like to do is by the end of this session, you to walk away feeling comfortable that we've answered some of the top three questions that we get. One, around what is the breakdown of personnel and operating costs in the Health Sciences Centre? Two, how is VSEP allocated? And then three, how can this financial information help us with balancing the budget this year? So you may have other questions. Please make sure you send them to us, you bring them up at the end, and we can either answer them at a later date. If we can answer some today, we will. But you're going to be getting a lot of information today, so I want to make sure that you walk away with some of these top answers to these top questions. And then finally, some resources that you can go to if you have questions or feedback. So, from what the Dean presented on March 23rd, OVC was forecasted to receive about $68.4 million in funding. And the bulk of this was coming from base provincial funding of $32.4 million. And our client revenue was forecasted to be $12.2 million. Now, how was it allocated? So this is all the funding that was coming in. So everything from research grants, fundraising was $5 million, OMAFRA, international tuition. I'm not going to rehash all of that because I want to get specifically to the Health Sciences Centre. Excuse me, and how was it allocated? The bulk of the $68.4 million went to the academic departments. So $35 million or 51% went to the academic departments. This chunk here, which we'll talk about today, is the clinical education program. And that's $18.6 million that was allocated to the clinical education program. And as a reminder, what the clinical education program is, it's really the environment for experiential learning and discovery. So it takes place within the Health Sciences Centre. And so it would include the clinical areas such as the specialty hospital for companion animals, the large animal hospital, field service, large animal clinical skills, and the primary health care facility. Okay, so that's all of the clinical education program where the funding was allocated. And as a reminder, the Health Sciences Centre, we do have a mandate to be fiscally viable, so we have to be financially responsible and balance our budget and strategically think about our future. We have some capital equipment that's starting to age, such as our MRI, and so we need just to think about how do we plan for that. Okay, a couple program definitions. So base provincial funding is the provincial operating grant. And so if you see that acronym, the POG is the provincial operating grant. VSEP is the funding that we receive through OMAFRA to support the veterinary clinical education program. And MTCU is Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities. And finally, special grant, SG, if you see that. And that's from MTCU for a specific purpose. Okay, so within the clinical education program, a few terms before we get started too fast in this. Please remember that a forecast is a prediction. So what I showed you the very first slide was a forecast. In March, that's what we thought was going to happen based on funding trends, expense trends, how things are going. But as of April 30th, that's our fiscal year. So then we can report actual numbers. So how did we do at the end of the year? And that's what I'll be sharing with you today. So we were very close to our predictions from last year. Another term is the deficit or a funding gap. And this is where you have more expenses than you do funds coming in. So not ideal. And what's left is a deficit situation or the gap. Net revenue, so when you see revenue numbers today up on the screen, we're talking net revenue. And what that means is revenue after adjustments for things like the example I have up on the screen is it might be a $1,000 bill to a client. They then return a pharmacy order for $100. The net revenue on that case is $900. Okay, so there are no expenses against that. This is only revenue. And then FTE is full-time equivalent, and this is a calculation. Here we use the calculation based on a total dollar amount divided by the annual salary and benefits earned by that full-time position. So for example, we may have 2 part-time technicians, 1 FTE. Okay, so if you look at some of our numbers, we have hundreds and hundreds of appointments, not many FTE, not the same number of FTE because of the part-time positions. And as a reminder, within the clinical environment of the Health Sciences Centre, so I said this in words earlier, but it does include all of the 5 spokes that you see here. And for last year, so the year ending 2011-12, what we are presenting is the Equine Sports Medicine and Reproduction Centre. Of course, it hasn't got going yet, but any revenues from lameness evaluations, et cetera, that we might consider sports medicine type cases for this presentation are within the large animal hospital numbers. And Animal Cancer Center numbers, so the oncology service is in the specialty hospital for companion animals. So going forward, we'd like to be able to report this separately, but for year ending, those are how we roll them up, okay? So out of the Health Sciences Centre, as we mentioned earlier, the funding that was coming to support the veterinary clinical education program was 18.4 million. Earlier we had forecasted it would be 18.6. It was a little bit lower because of client revenue, but we did receive 18.4 million in support for the clinical education program. So where did that come from? The bulk of it came from client revenue, 12 million. And then a big chunk of it came from the provincial operating grant, which was 5.6 million. And then a little bit here for fundraising, we had 693,000, and then the sliver of purple is annual new initiative funding, which was 172,000. So again, what's in red is the bulk of the money. Our funding source came from client revenue. So how did we allocate this revenue for the clinical education program? Again, the bulk of it went to the Health Sciences Centre. Specifically in green are the specialty hospitals, the tertiary care hospital, field service, so large animal and companion animal. The blue sliver is primary health care. That was about $1 million of funding was allocated there, and large animal clinical skills facility received 172,000. Now, moving forward, I'm going to talk about primary health care only for one more slide, and then we're going to not talk about this chunk of the pie anymore. We're going to focus on the green. But for primary health care, $1 million came from, and Dr. Conlon presented this on May 17th rather, so that's why I won't go into the details of the primary health care. But the bulk of the funding for primary health care, that what's in blue is client revenue. So this is new money. Red indicates fundraising, and that was specifically targeted for primary health care. And green was provincial operating money. Okay, and then our expenses are this yellow bar at the top. The Primary Health Care Centre did balance their budget this year at $1 million. So again, it's not new money. We didn't redirect that money from the Health Sciences Centre over to primary health care. This is new revenue coming into the primary health care. So if we didn't have primary health care, we wouldn't have that $1 million in funding either. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say now on primary health care. Won't talk any more in detail about the clinical skills building, but we will now talk about this green area, the specialty hospital and field service. So it's $17.2 million in funding in those areas. Okay, so where did it come from? Where did that $17.2 million come from? Again, the bulk of it comes from client revenue, $11.3 million in the specialty hospital. And then provincial operating grant is $5.4 million. And then we had some fundraising, about $500,000 of fundraising. Okay, so that's how we were funded this year, the $17.2 million in the Health Sciences Centre. Our expenses, however, were $18.5 million. The bulk of the expenses in blue, as you can see, are salary and benefits. So personnel salary and benefits came to 67% or $12.5 million. And operating expenses were $6 million, or about a third, 1/3, 2/3. So if you've done your math very quickly, you'll see 17.2 million in, 18.5 million out. Does not make a balanced budget. We did close the year with a deficit of $1.3 million in operating deficit in the Health Sciences Centre this year. So why is there a deficit in the clinical education program? And I do want to talk about a few things here. We said earlier the deficit is driven because your expenses are greater than your funding or your revenue in, your numbers in. And so some of the reasons, so let's talk about the expense side. We did have increasing expenses, whether it was from increased cost of teaching. When caseload goes down, you know, whether it's teaching animals or other costs go up, because we don't have client revenue to offset some of those costs now. So the actual expenses for some of the teaching went up a little bit last year. Between various bargaining groups and collective agreements, we did have some commitments for salary increases. So there are various reasons, and certainly inflationary costs on expenses, that costs went up. Funding went down. Now we did, as was presented in March, we did have a reduction of about $700,000 in the Health Sciences Centre based provincial operating funds. That was a contribution back to the university, but the university was helping us with inflationary costs. So it was basically a wash. So our base provincial operating funding was fairly flat. So this red line, the decrease in revenue, is really driven by client revenue for the most part. And so when we look at why, in December of 2007 is when the US economy was officially in a recession. The US officially declared a recession in December of 2007. Canada always follows suit about a year later, and that was the case. So in May of 2010, we were presenting what some of the trends were. We saw this coming after the recession hit, and we would hear from practitioners, and I'm sure everyone here has experienced it as well. Either practitioners were trying to keep some of the cases in-house because they were affected by it as well. Certainly the equine industry has suffered somewhat or significantly, so people were referring less. And the response that we've had from the US vet schools, as we presented again in May 2010, some schools have cut positions. So one school in the States cut 150 faculty and staff positions, also wage freezes or wage cutbacks. So obviously OVC didn't take it to that level, but the universities in the States are also faced, and in Canada, are faced with similar challenges. So that's why that funding line has gone down. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the trends that we were afraid that might happen. So in 2010, 2011, we did report the deficit. So we had the actual deficit of $2.1 million. And again, early on, so in 2009-10, we were looking at these trends and saying, okay, based on our current revenue and trends about the decline, how fast it was declining and caseload, we were really concerned that this pie, based on the financial modeling we did, this pie was targeted to be 2.9 million the following year if we didn't do something. So we did something, and we'll talk about the somethings in a minute, but so we did end up addressing that. So we did still close the books this year with a deficit, but not as significant as what it would have been had we not implemented some of the changes. So this year we reported an actual deficit of $1.3 million. So smaller slice of the pie, which is good news. Bad news is we still have a deficit. This year we're working towards an all blue circle, so a balanced budget without that funding gap. Okay, so many of you have heard me say this many times before, so why are we closing the gap, or how do we even address the deficit? There are really three levers that you can play with. One is you can increase your revenues, and revenues can come from client revenues, donations, multitude of revenues. You can reduce some of your expenses, or you can avoid some of your costs. And so we did a combination of all three this year. Specifically on the revenue side, compared to last year, our revenue did increase overall by 8%. So last year we reported revenue was 10.5 million. This is client revenue in the Health Sciences Centre, and this year we closed at 11.3 million. So that's a very good news story. And hospital visits also went up. Not as much as revenue, which obviously means we've had to do some fee adjustments, and that's in the strategy section. So we saw over 15,000 cases in the Health Sciences Centre. So what did we do to increase those revenue and cases? We did strategically increase fees in various areas based on consultation with service chiefs, and we're still in the process of working with many of you today on looking at those fees. We've also done a better job at capturing activity, and StringSoft has helped us do that at point of service. We've been trying to promote the Health Sciences Centre because there's competition for caseload. And so this is 2 years now in a row, we've had a booth at OVMA, and I know some of you have volunteered and spent time there promoting the Health Sciences Centre. And also some of the faculty have been involved in CE practitioner rounds that the hospital was involved in helping with this year. Improving client communication for getting estimates and collection of charges before the patient leaves the hospital. We have moved to a cost recovery for research activity in the hospital. And we did 2 years ago adjust the employee student courtesy discount to a flat 10%. And we are focusing, for the most part, veterinarian activities where we can, more on caseload and revenue. So we've done a number of things to move that mark from the 10.5 to 11.3 million. In terms of costs, we did adjust schedules and assignments so that we were able to not renew some of our contract staff positions or some of our part-time positions. We did transfer the budget and really the approval process for how some of the large animal teaching animals are managed to clinical studies. And we are looking, certainly we have about 10 trucks, trailers, vans in a fleet. So we have a mini fleet management strategy as well. So we're really looking at, do we need all those vehicles? At what point do we have to replace them? So we are looking at that. We also are looking at the service agreements. So we did renegotiate one of our service agreements and achieve some savings there. We've realigned some of the management positions that were open positions, and I'll talk a little bit more about the management staffing in a minute. And then also looking at clinical support, so making sure that we provide the resources when there is a clinical need to provide that. And then finally, redirecting, we did shift, as many of you know, from Meditech implementation of a hospital information management system to StringSoft. And that saved us over $500,000 a year in maintenance costs for what Meditech was going to be, plus another bunch of money to finish the implementation. Okay, so that's a few of the strategies to address the deficit. Now, in terms of looking at the expense side of the coin, so we talked about already $18.5 million in expenses is what the Health Sciences Centre had this year. The bulk of it, 2/3, personnel, salary, and benefits. So let's look into that a little bit more. So out of the $12.5 million in salary and benefits, certainly the bulk of the expenses for personnel, salary, and benefits come from technicians. We have 64 FTE, so again, more bodies than that, but 64 full-time equivalents. We spend $5.1 million on salary and benefits, or 41%. The clinical support area includes animal housing, animal care attendants, client services, pharmacy, sterile processing, stores, MRI tech, and DI administrator. And there's 50 FTE there, so that's our second biggest category at $3.6 million. The third category is our clinicians. So these don't include faculty, which are paid through MTCU. This would be our veterinarians, interns, and residents that come out of the hospital budget, 26.5 FTE. Management, so professional managerial, we have 13 FTE, which is 1.1 million, and I'll break that down a little bit more. And then clerical, that includes medical records, the hospital information system, payroll, and business office. We have 10 FTE there, and that's about 600,000. Okay, so let me talk a little bit specifically about the management section, because that was one of the questions that did come up. It's 1.1 million is what we spend, or 6% of our personnel salary and benefits. So I mentioned we have 13 FTE in the management category, and it's broken really into 3 categories. We have senior management, which is in the blue. There's 3 FTE there, and that would be the director or the chief medical officer, and that position is vacant. And then our senior manager of finance and our senior manager of operations. So those are those 3 positions. In green, we have the clinical managers. So clinical management includes, and again, this is as of April 30th, we had 2 supervisors, a pharmacy manager, facilities coordinator, and an open client services manager. Okay, so that was 5 FTE. And then the third category in red is the administrative management. So that would include medical records and risk management. That's 1 position. Business office, materials management, and workforce effectiveness, as well as the managing assistant. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the management positions for the 1.1 million. Now, so what does that mean? To put it into context, we have not added any management positions since 2009. We have, however, repurposed and refocused existing positions that are P&M positions that were open. So, you know, we had also, like departments do too, we had been banking on some salary savings. And when we look at certain positions based on where we need to go, we said, you know what, let's redefine that position because we now need them to be doing this set of skills and activities because we're headed in this direction. So we did realign that. We still have 2 open positions, as I mentioned, the director/CMO and the client services manager. Post-budget, so after April 30th, we did, if we go back to the number of FTE that we have, we talked about all the technicians and animal care attendants, housing. So we have a significant number of people, let's say around 100 people, more than that. And 2 supervisors was clearly not going to be sufficient to provide support, coaching, and development for all of our staff. So we have increased to 4 supervisors now. Really pleased to have, so Anne is still in her position, and very pleased that we had 2 internals in those roles as well. So we have Julie and Ingrid, and we have 1 person, Elise, from external. So we have 4 positions. Now, overall, we do not expect to increase our FTE. So next year, we hope that we'll be relatively flat in FTE, and the gains that we're going to be making, these supervisors are out on the floor more, and they're working with the staff. So we're hoping to gain some effectiveness and efficiencies on the floor. So again, we hope that that will help us with overall FTE. Okay, so let's now talk about the other chunk of our expenses, which are the operating dollars. That's 6 million of the 18.5 million goes into operating. Okay, so out of the 6 million, the bulk of it is for medical and pharmacy supplies. So a little under half goes to that. Equipment, so that's purchases, repair, replacements, and service. And I'm going to break this category down a little bit more. The third category, about 900,000, goes to external services. So that'd be lab, laundry, OMAFRA, and research billing. And then the other category is 1.1 million. And again, I'll break out the 1.1 million. Okay, so let's look at equipment first. So we spent, or we've accrued or allocated $1.5 million in expenses. We actually spent, so about $200,000 for hospital equipment this year, plus the autoclave, which some of you, especially those of you in surgery who I see here, will appreciate. $128,000 is what the new autoclave cost us. We had 2 autoclaves over 30 years old, and they were no longer working, or one wasn't working any longer. So the good news is we do have that. That just got installed last week. But some of the other components, so I'll touch on a few of these. The equipment, so the telephone project, the telephony project, that 150,000 are for the little black phones that you have. We were advised by CCS last year that we need to start looking at an alternative solution, and then last month they met with us again saying you need to look at an alternative solution. We're out of capacity and antiquated systems. So we haven't spent that money yet, but it is budgeted. Unfortunately, it's come in quite a bit more than what we had hoped for, so we need just to continue working with them. And again, we'll touch base. A lot of you provided feedback before for this project, so we may be reaching out to you again. MRROA is it's a fund that we have to start now putting money away for large capital equipment. So in this case, it's we're starting to grow some money for the MRI. We don't know how long their MRI might be here with us a long time, but if we don't have it, we can count on probably, you know, let's say $1 million by the time you're done installing. What I have learned here is that it costs a lot more than you think to install pieces of equipment and make modifications, etc. So we do have $150,000 in that bucket. This year we've allocated $150,000 for the greatest need for the Health Sciences Centre. So again, we spent $197,000 last year. And Brent Rumford chairs the Capital Expenditures Committee, and that's part of the Hospital Advisory Committee gets a report on what the clinicians are saying is the greatest need, why. The committee gets together, tries to prioritize. And then that's, for example, that's how we got some of this equipment up here. Service contracts, and then these are actually service contracts that we spent. So our MRI cost us $179,000 in a service contract for 1 year. That's a lot of money. So that's a lot of MRIs we need to be doing to make that balance from a finance standpoint. Okay, so I won't go into all of those details, but that's the breakdown of the equipment. In the other category, I mentioned there was $1.1 million. The biggest chunk of this goes to financing. So that's credit card fees and provision for bad debt. So it's an accounting allocation. So $272,000. Telephones, etc. long distance, $268,000. The Client Experience Improvement Project is matching funds for a bequest that we also received, and this is for the companion animal renovations for the admitting and reception area. That project, you probably saw in the OVC bulletin a call for committee members for that. We'd like to get going on that, but we have to raise a lot more money before we can actually finish that project because it's probably around a $2 million project, so it'll come through fundraising. We do pay licenses, as most of you know, so CVO and OVMA membership we pay. Vehicles I've already mentioned, it's about $95,000 we spend in vehicles, and then smaller amounts, so even under the travel and entertainment that included the AAEP breakfast that we sponsored last December. Okay, so that's in the other category. Okay, so that's all the expense side. So I've gone through all the breakdown of the personnel expenses, the management expenses, the FTE. We've talked about the operating expenses. So that was the first question. Where does the money go? So now the other question is around the funding piece. So to talk about where the money comes in. Again, as a reminder, we're talking about the big green piece, the $17.2 million. And out of the $17.2 million, no surprise, the bulk of it comes from the client revenue, as we've mentioned. So $11.3 million this year came from client revenue. We also had $5.4 million come from the provincial operating grants. And again, as you remember, I mentioned at the beginning, it's fairly flat as far as what we've received. And then about $500,000 in fundraising. Okay, specifically on the client revenue side now, let's break that down. So out of the $11.3 million that I've just reported, 84% of it comes from the companion animal hospital, so about $9.5 million. Ruminant field service accounts for $148,000 and large animal $1.6 million. So if we look at trends here, companion animal in the pink on the top has grown into, so the year starting here is 2004 to 2012. So we've grown from 5.3 to 9.5 in companion animal and 3.2 to 1.6 in large animal. This is in revenue. And then if we look specifically at companion animal as far as visits go, our visits have been fairly steady over the years. Our average transaction has grown. So our average transaction in the companion animal hospital is $693. But you can see here that this is the last year we've had this bump. So overall, a fairly steady increase with the exception of the recession adjustment. Large animal, again, what is in blue is revenue, red is caseload. So we had, from visits, we ended with just shy of 1,500 visits, around 14 and change. And our average transaction in large animal is 1123. So it's gone from 1620 to 1123. Okay, so that's client revenue. Now we'll talk a little bit about the provincial operating grant, because that was the second question, if you remember. Where does the VSEP money, how does that get spent and where does it come from? So I want to just talk about the $5.4 million for a minute. As a reminder, from the March 23rd presentation, what part of the $32.4 million of the provincial operating grant goes to support the Health Sciences Centre? The answer is $5.4 million. So 32.4 was at a college level, 5.4 came to the Health Sciences Centre. How is that broken down? Out of the VSEP, we received $2.5 million, MTCU 2.3, and MTCU special grant $600,000. Okay, now again from the March 23rd presentation, this side of the pie here is what's supporting the Health Sciences Centre. So 1.9 million is for the HSC staff pool. So that's personnel costs and benefits. Veterinarians, which is this chunk here, is 3.2 FTE or 480,000. And interns 5 FTE or 133,000. So this is what affects the Health Sciences Centre. This side is faculty, externship, DVSC. So that's not part of the Health Sciences Centre. This chunk of the pie is. And as a reminder, the VSEP is the Veterinary Clinical Education Program. It's an allocation, so it doesn't say, we're going to support this service or this person. It does break it into these buckets. And then it's an allocation from there, because it's very difficult for us to just pinpoint, well, how much of your activity, how many hours did you spend teaching versus someone else? So again, it's allocated across the HSC. So as a breakdown though, remember our expenses were 18.5 million. The VSEP allocation we talked about was 2.5 million. MTCU special grant was close to 600,000. Fundraising was close to 500,000. And then the balance, and the balance doesn't mean this was all funding. The balance was, where are we short for the 18.5 is 14.9 million, and that was either through MTCU, unallocated, through client revenue, or it's the gap. It's that sliver of pie that we don't have enough money for. So just looking at VSEP for a minute, this 2.5 million, we've already talked about 1.9 went to support staff, 480,000 went to support veterinarians, and 133,000 went to support interns. And this is just a different way of looking at it. In the light purple is the VSEP allocation, and everything else, so no money went to operating from VSEP dollars. It all went to personnel. Okay. Probably worth mentioning is the numbers too. So out of the interns residents, so VSEP supports 5 out of 16 FTE that we currently have. Veterinarians, VSEP supports 3.2 out of the 10.5 FTE, and staff, it supports 23 out of the 137 staff that we have. So that's the allocation. Another point that I just wanted to bring up is around how do we pay for some of the big capital projects that you're seeing. Most of it is through fundraising, and whether it's bequests, Pet Trust has been a big sponsor for the Animal Cancer Center project. It's through donor support. Equine Sports Medicine Reproduction was through donor support. The ICU IMC renovations was from Vitamin Lawsuit Settlement, a class action settlement years ago. Companion Animal Admitting Reception renovations, I've already mentioned that we have a bequest and then some matching funds from the Health Sciences Center. And we need to finish that with donations, so we're still in a fundraising mode there. And Barn 37 Clinical Skills was through OMAFRA, so that's VSEP as well as donors. Okay, so now we've talked about sort of the operating costs, we've talked about the personnel costs, we've talked about all of the funding coming in. So how does this information help us now balance our budget? We are working towards a balanced budget this year, meaning funding will equal expenses. We don't want a deficit. If that's the case, we have to find about $2 million in revenue, or the equivalent in maybe less revenue, but also cutting some of our expenses. We also need to continue to think strategically and put some money away for the future for things like the MRI. And the whole team, we're very optimistic that we'll achieve this. It's been a lot of hard work, and I kudos to the staff and all the staff, not just management staff, clinical support, faculty, veterinarians, because it has been a challenging year to bring us to a $1.3 million deficit, but we're not done yet. We are going to work towards flattening that and balancing the budget this year, and we do need your help and ideas on how we can do that. So all things being equal, I mentioned that when we finished the year with a $1.3 million deficit, so let's pretend revenue stayed the same, expenses stayed the same, which it never will, but all things being equal, we have to either increase revenues, decrease expenses, or avoid some costs, or play with these three. Okay, and again, we've already talked about where revenue doesn't have to be from clients only. So here, these are just examples of what we could do together. The first scenario is we could increase revenue by $2 million. But of course, if you're going to increase revenue by that much, you're going to see expenses also increase for supplies and perhaps even some personnel. And so that would be a $1.3 million. This is a very simplistic way to look at it. But that, when we do that, if we look at the fact that companion animal is 84% of the cases that we see, or revenue rather, in the Health Sciences Center, if I use that average transaction, it equates to 2886 cases a year additionally we'd have to see, or 12 cases a day across the Health Sciences Center. And if large animal increases in caseload as well, it's even fewer. We might even be looking at, say, 10 cases a day, because their average transaction is higher than companion animal. So it's, when we're saying 10 to 12 cases a day across the entire Health Sciences Center, it's not so overwhelming. But that would be one example. I didn't break that down for scenarios 2 and 3, but if we say, no, we don't want to hang our hat just on increasing revenue, we could say, okay, let's increase revenue by only 1.3 million and keep expenses flat. But that would mean really reducing expenses, because you can't increase revenue without some bump in expenses. Just for, as we saw, most of that comes from pharmacy and supplies. So it actually does mean we'll have to trim a little bit there. The more drastic and perhaps harder from an operational implementation would be scenario 3, and that's only if we increase revenues by $1 million, because we'd still have to decrease expenses by $300,000. So options are on the table, and we do need to figure out how to balance the budget this year. So as far as your ideas and resources, we have, as hopefully everybody has heard and read in the bulletin, we did expand the Hospital Advisory Committee. And so the names are up there, so you're welcome to send the representative from your department or your area. You can certainly send comments to me or to the Dean's office. We also have Dean's Advisory Council, that's a new council. And we also, a new committee formed is the Hospital Advisory Committee, the Finance Committee. So it's part of the Hospital Advisory Committee, but this group specifically looks at the finances. So we did a dry run, for example, of this presentation with the actually the whole Hospital Advisory Committee, just to get some feedback in terms of clarity and what people want to hear. So these are the different avenues that you can send your feedback and get, say, hey, I'd really like to see this at the next update. We have committed to doing these 3 times a year. So every semester. It's an incredible amount of work to pull together, and it's a very complex system. So hopefully we've tried to make it look easy and quite straightforward, but there is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. So again, we welcome your thoughts, but our goal today was to answer those 3 questions and then also provide an overview of where all the expenses are, the data that you wanted to see. Okay, so at this point we do have time for questions, so I'm happy to answer any questions you have.